Good Friday is a significant day for the Catholic community, but a disappearance on that very day shook the Steel Valley in 1972. 12-year-old Brad Lee Bellino went missing while walking home from a friend's house. 4 days later, his body was found inside a trash container behind Isley's Dairy Store at Boardman Plaza, covered in debris and cardboard boxes, with a belt tightened around his neck. At first, it looked like a case that might be solved quickly. The killer lived just 5 miles from Brad's home. But that wasn't the case. It would take police 51 years to finally identify him. So why did it take so long to solve a case that seemed to have clear answers from the start? Was this another failure of the system, or did the killer simply hide in plain sight? Join us at the last chapter for today's story. Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Let's see how far this case has reached. All right, let's get started. The industrial landscape of Northeast Ohio in the early 1970s was defined by the towering smokestacks of the Steel Valley, a region where the rhythm of daily life was dictated by the shifts at the local mills. In Youngstown, the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company served as the economic heartbeat for thousands of families, including the household of Joseph and Olivia Bellino. On April 7, 1959, the couple welcomed their fourth and youngest child, Brad Lee Bellino, into a world that felt fundamentally secure. Growing up in a mid-century American landscape, Brad was often described by those in his Mahoning County neighborhood as a gentle child, possessed of a sunny disposition. However, beneath this calm exterior resided an adventurous spirit. To his best friend, Brad was the architect of their childhood escapades, the one who would conceive of a risk while others followed in his wake. The Bellino family dynamic reflected the hard-working middle-class ethos of the era. While Joseph spent his days immersed in the demanding environment of the steel plant, Elisa, often referred to as Lisa, built a career as a buyer for the retailer Lane Bryant. Together with Brad's 2 older brothers and his older sister, the family resided on McClurg Road, a place where the concept of domestic security was an undisputed reality rather than a concern. In this pocket of Boardman, Ohio, the boundaries of a child's world were wide and largely unsupervised. It was a time and place where the glow of evening streetlights served as the universal signal for children to return home, and the thought of a locked door was often treated as an optional precaution rather than a necessity. Tragedy, in this environment, was viewed as a distant anomaly, a narrative reserved for other places and other people. By the dawn of 1972, 12-year-old Brad Bellino had entered the 6th grade, a period of life defined largely by his inseparable bond with his peer, Don Templeman. Their relationship transcended the typical boundaries of middle school friendship, evolving into a brotherhood that made the two families feel like a single unit. Because the Bellinos were often occupied by the rigorous demands of their professional lives, Brad frequently found a second home with the close-knit Templeman family. The 3-mile journey between Brad's residence at 61 McClurg Road and the Templeman home in the Applewood Acres development on Tickner Drive was a distance Brad traversed routinely on his bicycle. This commute was a staple of their shared lives, particularly during baseball season when the boys played on a team coached by Don's father. In the social context of 1972, this level of independence for a 12-year-old was unremarkable. Law enforcement of the era had not yet begun to grapple with the stranger danger phenomenon that would later redefine American parenting. During these years, police departments operated in localized silos with little centralized communication regarding transient threats or predatory patterns. The safety of a child was largely entrusted to the collective eyes of a neighborhood that assumed everyone belonged. After evening practices or games, it was a common courtesy for Don's mother to drive Brad back to McClurg Road, as the adults maintained an unspoken rule that the 3-mile trek should not be undertaken alone once the sun had set. This routine, however, was disrupted on Friday, March 31, 1972. It was the beginning of Easter break, a time of leisure for the two boys who had spent the day exploring the town on foot, leaving their bicycles behind. As the afternoon waned, Brad prepared to head home, but the logistics of his return had become complicated. His mother was at work and his father was unavailable to collect him. Within the Templeman household, the usual safety net was also fraying. Don's mother was out grocery shopping, and his father was confined to bed, incapacitated by a severe bout of the flu. Despite the lack of a ride, Brad remained undeterred. Confident in his knowledge of the route he had traveled countless times before, he decided to make the journey back to his family's home on foot. At approximately 7:30 p.m., as the horizon began to surrender to the evening shadows, Brad Bellino walked away from the Templeman residence for the final time. The departure set into motion a series of chronological discrepancies and miscommunications that would haunt the investigation for decades. According to official records, Joseph Bellino had last seen his son the previous day, Thursday, March 30th, at approximately 1 p.m. At that time, Brad had requested permission to visit the mall and subsequently spend the night at Don's house, with the understanding that he would return by 4 p.m. on Friday. On Friday afternoon, Brad had even telephoned his father to ask for an extension of his stay until 9 p.m. Joseph, assuming his son would be driven home as was the custom, granted the request. The reasons behind Brad's decision to leave the Templemans an hour and a half earlier than his curfew remained a subject of intense scrutiny. When Joseph returned home that night and found his son's bed empty, he did not immediately alarm. He operated under the logical assumption that the boys had simply changed their plans and that Brad had remained at the Templeman house for a second night. It was not until Saturday at noon, nearly 16 and a half hours after Brad had stepped out into the Friday night air, that the gravity of the situation began to surface. A phone call between the two households revealed the terrifying reality. The Bellinos believed Brad was with the Templemans, and the Templemans believed Brad had reached home the night before. Amidst the growing panic, a conflicting narrative emerged from the memory of Don Templeman. He recalled the evening differently than the official coroner's timeline, remembering a plan where the boys would alternate nights at each other's houses throughout the break. Don maintained that Brad had called his own home on Friday evening to inform his brother that he would be staying with Don again. According to Don, it was a return call from Brad's father, shortly thereafter, that directed the boy to come home that night instead. Don further recalled his mother waking him around 10 p.m. that Friday, visibly worried after receiving a call from Brad's brother asking if the 12-year-old had left yet. Though Don and his mother searched the immediate neighborhood that night, they found no sign of the boy in the darkness of Applewood Acres. By 3:20 p.m. on Saturday, Brad Bellino was officially reported missing to the Boardman police. While Brad was known to be an active child who enjoyed roaming the local area, his failure to check in with either family overnight signaled a departure from his usual patterns. As Saturday night fell and transitioned into Sunday morning, the community's initial hope began to evaporate, replaced by the chilling realization that the safety they had so long taken for granted had been shattered. For the next several days, the search intensified, retracing every possible path Brad might have taken on his 3-mile walk home. However, the answer to Brad's whereabouts would not be found on the suburban sidewalks or in the yards of his neighbors. Instead, the investigation would shift to the commercial hub of the Boardman Plaza, where a routine morning for a sanitation worker was about to become a historical turning point for the city's law enforcement. On the morning of Tuesday, April 4th, 1972, at approximately 8 a.m., the investigation transformed from a search for a missing child into a homicide inquiry. Paul Smith, a sanitation worker for the city, was performing his routine collection at a dumpster in the Boardman Plaza when he discovered the lifeless remains of Brad Lee Bellino. The boy was found lying face down beneath a layer of refuse, a sight marked by the tragic image of his small sneakers protruding from the corner of the container. The scene was one of profound violation. Brad's pants had been undone and pulled down, and he had been subjected to a sexual assault. The cause of death was immediately apparent to the responding officers. Brad's own belt had been fastened tightly around his neck, serving as the instrument of his strangulation. The intersection of professional duty and personal tragedy became a reality for Tony D'Appolito, a young officer on the Youngstown Vice Squad and Brad's first cousin. Summoned to the scene by Boardman police to provide a positive identification, D'Appolito was forced to confront the reality of his cousin's murder. The burden of informing Brad's parents, Lisa and Joseph, fell to him, a task for which no amount of police training could prepare an individual. At the local middle school, the news arrived with a jarring lack of clarity. When it was announced to the student body that Brad had been found, the initial reaction from the classroom was one of cheers, as the children mistakenly believed their classmate had been found alive. It was only when the mathematics teacher clarified that Brad was dead that the room fell into a stunned silence, leaving his best friend Don Templeman in a state of shock that eventually led to his early dismissal from the school day. The subsequent forensic examination by the coroner provided a series of data points that would both clarify and complicate the investigation. Brad was small for his 12 years, standing 4 feet tall and weighing approximately 80 pounds. This lack of physical stature perhaps explained why the belt found around his neck, a size 22 to 24, typically intended for a child of 5 or 6, was able to fit him. While Don Templeman was later asked to identify the belt and confirmed it belonged to his friend, the Bellino family remained uncertain of its origin. More significantly, the autopsy revealed no outward signs of a struggle. This suggested a power dynamic in which the 12-year-old was either rapidly overpowered by a much larger assailant, or, as was considered though not confirmed by the era's limited toxicology screening, possibly sedated. A critical discrepancy emerged regarding the time of death. The initial coroner's report estimated that Brad had died around 9 p.m. on Saturday, a full 25.5 hours after he was last seen leaving the Templeman home. However, this estimation stood in direct conflict with the contents of Brad's stomach. The digestive process had stopped while the boy's final meal, the chicken and pineapple dinner he had eaten at Don's house on Friday evening, was still largely intact. In the forensic science of 1972, the rate of gastric emptying was often a more reliable indicator of the post-mortem interval than other methods. This biological evidence suggested that Brad had likely been killed shortly after his disappearance on Friday night, rendering several subsequent sightings of the boy on Saturday highly improbable. These reported sightings, which placed Brad at the local mall, playing basketball near Applewood Acres, and visiting a Dairy Queen, highlight the inherent fallibility of witness memory during high-stress events. It is a phenomenon often seen in cold cases where the community's collective desire to help inadvertently creates a trail of ghost sightings. Because the children were off from school on Friday, witnesses likely conflated their memories of seeing Brad earlier in the week or mistook another child for the missing boy. While these leads were pursued with diligence by Boardman authorities, they ultimately served as distractions from the narrow window of time on Friday evening when Brad first encountered his killer. The investigation was further complicated by conflicting accounts, a common issue in early 1970s police work. Decades later, Don Templeman would vividly recall being shown a stick by officers and told it was involved in the sexual assault, a detail that retired investigators would later claim never existed in the official evidence files. This friction between witness memory and official records is a hallmark of long-term cold cases, where the trauma of the event can sharpen certain recollections while distorting others. In the wake of the discovery, the community attempted to find closure through ritual. Hundreds attended Brad's funeral before he was laid to rest at Greenhaven Memorial Gardens. Yet, for the investigators and the family, the ritual was hollow without an identity for the monster who had moved through their safe streets unnoticed. Two detectives, Jack Nichols, who would eventually become the Boardman police chief, and Robert Roop became the primary stewards of Brad's case. They engaged in the painstaking, old-school detective work of the era, manually combing through bins of evidence and re-interviewing neighbors and persons of interest. Over the years, their efforts narrowed a massive list of potential suspects down to 7 recurring names. However, the forensic limitations of the 20th century provided a ceiling they could not break through. Without a confession or an eyewitness to the abduction itself, the 7 suspects remained a list of possibilities, rather than a path to an indictment. Among the most persistent leads from the early days of the investigation was a memory belonging to Don Templeman, one that had haunted him since the afternoon of the disappearance. He recalled a brown van that seemed to shadow the 2 boys as they walked through the town earlier that Friday. According to Don, the vehicle had appeared at multiple locations, a presence so conspicuous that the boys initially joked about it before a sense of unease drove them toward the safety of the Templeman home. In the context of 1970s law enforcement, tracing such a vehicle was a Herculean task. Without a license plate or a digital database of registered owners, detectives were forced to manually cross-reference hundreds of similar vehicles, a process that ultimately failed to produce a suspect or a definitive owner. This brown van became a spectral figure in the case, a symbol of the predatory presence that had invaded their suburban sanctuary. As the years stretched into decades, the Bellino family attempted to navigate a world that had been irrevocably altered. Elisa Bellino remained in the family home on McClurg Road for years following the tragedy, a quiet testament to the life her youngest son had once lived there. Joseph Bellino, however, would pass away in 1990, nearly 2 decades after the crime, leaving this life without the resolution he had sought since that cold April morning in 1972. Don Templeman eventually moved away from Northeast Ohio, distancing himself from the geography of his grief. Yet, the case possessed a unique gravity that pulled the participants back in, regardless of time or distance. In the year 2000, while vacationing with his family at Disney World, Don received a phone call from a detective. The first time anyone had officially questioned him about the events since the year of the murder. While his children played in a hotel pool, Don sat in a room and recounted every detail he could remember, a reminder that for those who loved Brad, the investigation was a perpetual state of mind. A significant forensic milestone occurred in 2001 under the direction of then Police Chief Jeff Patterson. Recognizing that the science of the 21st century might finally unlock the secrets held by the evidence gathered in 1972, Patterson ordered Brad's clothing to be sent to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation Forensic Laboratory. This decision proved pivotal. Technicians were able to isolate a DNA profile from biological material found on the clothing Brad had been wearing at the time of his death. To ensure that this profile belonged to the assailant and not to the victim himself, a somber legal and forensic process was initiated. Brad's body was exhumed from Greenhaven Memorial Gardens. DNA was extracted from his femur bone and compared to samples from his mother, confirming that the foreign profile found on the clothing did indeed belong to an unknown male individual, the person who had taken Brad's life. Around this same period, investigators turned their attention to the belt used in the crime. It was submitted to a forensic dentist who identified distinct teeth marks near the end of the leather. This evidence suggested a terrifying level of physical struggle, or perhaps a behavioral quirk of the killer, yet the bite marks were not clear enough to create a full dental pattern for comparison. Despite these advancements, the creation of a DNA profile led to a frustrating plateau. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, with the expectation that such a violent offender would surely be in the national database. The lack of a match was both shocking and deeply perplexing to the Boardman investigators. The failure of CODIS to identify the killer highlights the institutional and legislative gaps that often hinder the pursuit of justice in older cases. In the early 2000s, several states lacked retroactivity conditions in their DNA laws, meaning that individuals who had been incarcerated or released before the enactment of these mandates in the 1990s often had no genetic profile on file. Furthermore, Jurisdictional inconsistencies and administrative delays meant that even high-risk offenders could slip through the cracks of the system. For another 20 years, the killer's genetic code sat in a digital vault, a known quantity with no name attached to it. It wasn't until 2019 that a new strategy, one that bypassed the limitations of criminal databases entirely, would finally bring the decades of silence to an end. The technological ceiling that had long confined the investigation finally shattered in 2019, when Boardman Police Captain Albert Kakas revisited the case with a new investigative philosophy. By this time, the forensic landscape had been revolutionized by the emergence of forensic genetic genealogy, a method that bypassed the limitations of criminal databases like CODIS by utilizing the vast public repositories of genetic information hosted by companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe. This approach shifted the focus from the individual killer to his entire biological lineage, effectively turning the perpetrator's relatives into unwitting witnesses for the state. To facilitate this complex undertaking, the department contracted with Parabon Nanolabs, a specialized laboratory that could translate the killer's DNA into both a physical profile and a genealogical map. The initial results provided by Parabon offered the first visual glimpse of the man who had abducted Brad Bellino. Based on his genetic markers, the suspect was identified as an individual of Welsh ancestry, likely possessing fair skin, brown or hazel eyes, and hair that ranged from dark brown to black. However, identifying a specific name within a vast ethnic lineage required a grueling process of elimination. For 4 years, investigators and genealogists meticulously reconstructed family trees, tracing branches back to the 1800s before working their way forward to the present day. This was a massive administrative and financial undertaking, costing the department approximately $29,000. A significant investment for a municipal agency, but one deemed necessary to resolve the half-century-old mystery. The process of reverse genealogy involved identifying individuals in the modern day who shared significant percentages of DNA with the unknown sample, and then voluntarily collecting their genetic material to narrow the search. Boardman Police Chief Todd Worth later described this period as one of persistent trial and error. Investigators would focus on one branch of an extended family tree, only to have it eliminated by a DNA match, forcing them to move to the next. The ethical and legal layers of this process were complex, as it required law enforcement to navigate the private lives of citizens who were entirely unaware that a member of their family had committed a brutal crime decades earlier. The breakthrough finally arrived through a relative of the suspect who, upon being approached by authorities, agreed to provide a voluntary DNA sample. The results of this specific test were definitive, establishing a direct familial link to the genetic material found on Brad's clothing in 1972. When the family tree was finally narrowed to its final lethal branch, it pointed to a man named Joseph Norman Hill. At the time of the murder, Hill was a 32-year-old married man living on Shadyside Drive in Boardman, a residence located less than 5 miles from Brad Bellino's home. His professional life as a truck driver delivering water bottles provided him with both the mobility and the local knowledge to navigate the suburban streets of the Steel Valley without raising suspicion. This revelation brought a chilling clarity to the brown van lead that had persisted since 1972. As a delivery driver, Hill was a man whose presence in a vehicle on residential streets was a common, unremarkable sight. He was part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm, a predator hidden in plain view behind the wheel of a commercial vehicle. The identification of Hill also explained why his profile had never appeared in CODIS. Though he had moved frequently and lived a nomadic existence, he had managed to avoid the specific type of post-1990s felony convictions that would have mandated the collection of his DNA. However, the victory of identifying him was tempered by a final chronological irony. Joseph Norman Hill had passed away from cancer in 2019, the very same year that Boardman police had initiated the genealogical testing that would eventually unmask him. Justice, in its legal form, had been outpaced by time. The identification of Joseph Norman Hill as the killer of Brad Bellino did more than resolve a single cold case. It unveiled a predatory history that likely spanned decades and multiple states. Following the 2019 breakthrough, Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost explicitly categorized Hill as a serial killer, suggesting that the truck driver's journey through 14 different residences, including a 1978 relocation to San Bernardino, California, was marked by a trail of victims. This nomadic lifestyle is a common characteristic of high-frequency offenders who utilize the anonymity of the interstate highway system and the lack of interagency communication to evade detection. For Hill, his professional life as a delivery driver provided the perfect cover for his movements, allowing him to observe potential targets in residential neighborhoods across the country. The most immediate consequence of the Bellino investigation was the re-examination of the 1975 disappearance of 13-year-old David Evans. Reported missing on January 18th of that year, David's frozen body was discovered 5 days later in the backyard of a home on Crestline Place, a location roughly 1 mile from his own residence. At the time, the death was officially ruled a result of natural causes. Because David was diabetic, authorities concluded he had suffered a diabetic coma and succumbed to hypothermia. However, the original autopsy had noted suspicious abrasions and broken bones, leading some investigators to speculate that the boy might have been dumped by someone who panicked when he became unresponsive. In the wake of the Bellino discovery, Dr. David Kennedy initiated a comprehensive review of the Evans file, eventually reclassifying the death as a homicide due to the presence of perimortem fractures and a post-mortem puncture wound. When DNA recovered from David's underwear was compared against the genetic profile of Joseph Norman Hill's relatives, the result was a definitive match. This forensic link provided a somber confirmation of Attorney General Yost's assessment. Brad Bellino had not been an isolated victim, and Hill's predatory patterns were established long before he left Ohio for the West Coast. Investigators also revisited the 1970 murder of 15-year-old Thomas Baird, who was found brutally beaten and later died from his injuries. While Baird had survived for 10 days in the hospital and claimed to know his attacker, he refused to identify the individual before he passed away. Although the proximity in time and geography prompted a review, detectives eventually determined that the circumstances of Baird's death differed significantly from the predatory signatures seen in the Bellino and Evans cases. As of the current investigation, the Baird case remains an active inquiry, though it is not formally linked to Hill. This distinction highlights the precision of modern forensics, which allows law enforcement to separate the actions of one monster from the general background of local crime. The resolution of these cases was marked by a formal press conference where the Bellino family was present, though they chose to maintain a dignified silence rather than make public announcements. Their presence served as a testament to a half-century of endurance and a final opportunity to personally thank the investigators, men like Jack Nichols and Robert Rupp, who had refused to let the case be forgotten. While Chief Todd Worth noted that there was sufficient evidence to secure a grand jury indictment had Hill still been alive, the lack of a trial meant that legal justice remained out of reach. In its place was a profound, if bittersweet, sense of closure. The story of Brad Lee Bellino and David Evans serves as a case study in the evolution of American justice. It illustrates a transition from an era of localized, siloed policing to a modern age where heroes in lab coats can reach across 50 years of history to provide answers. Though Joseph Norman Hill avoided a prison cell, the scientific record now permanently associates his name with the crimes he committed. For the community of Boardman and the families who lived through the Steel Valley's darkest chapters, the silence has finally been replaced by the truth, ensuring that the memories of the boys who never made it home are no longer tethered to an unsolved mystery. Do you think Brad Bellino's case, and the others linked to it, would ever have been solved without Captain Albert Kakis's determination to reopen the files? Share your thoughts in the comments and help us spread the message. The pursuit of truth knows no expiration date.